my part was on reflective learning, and in particular guided reflective journaling. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I just had a conversation with Sequita when we were in the other room, and it's also part of her research. And so I'm hoping that we have a very rich and interactive discussion as we move through some of the information that hopefully you will share, we will share with each other. So this is one of my, let me make that a little bit bigger just to make it bigger. I'm purposely not using PowerPoint. I'm trying to stay away from PowerPoint this year. I want to have more conversations and a little less that. So anyhow, these are two of my very favorite quotes about reflection and how it can impact our lives. I don't actually have the date for Socrates' quote, but it's understood that he at one point made this statement before he chose his demise. But I don't know if anybody's familiar with the book, The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. Is anybody familiar with that book? I love that book. But he just had this one little statement in that book, and I snatched it. And I've been using it since, because I just really believe in the power of reflection. I believe that it can really change students' thinking when you help them think through their thinking. And that's basically what reflection is. Thinking about your thinking, and then hopefully it's helping you to change your perspective in some situations, or maybe in some situations it helps to reinforce what you know. There's a lot of research out there on reflective learning and using guided reflection, and how it can help students to develop their professional identities, to help them think critically. So I'm going to start with a question. What types of reflection assignments do you include in your courses, and why do you include them? Or do you include them? And if you don't, then why not? And that's fine if you don't, but I'm just curious. Go ahead, Sequita.
For doctoral students, we meet once a week on weekends. We have weekend classes, and I have them after they've had 10 hours of learning Friday night and all day Saturday, turn in a reflection. Because it's not a paper, it's answering 6 questions. What have you learned about a particular topic? I have them choose the 2 topics. What have you learned? What did you know about this topic before? What changes in your life, in your perspective, happened as you were learning? What will you do with the new learning? So I'm speaking about past, present, and then future. And I have them reflect, because it's a shame to sit in a class for 10 hours, 12 hours, and don't think about what you're going to do with the stuff that you walk away with. So it's an effort to have them really think about what they're learning. And since it's a doctoral program, what are you going to put into practice when you go back to your job?
Good. Okay. Did everybody on Zoom, are we able to hear Sequita's comments?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Anybody else? Anybody on Zoom?
Some short discussion posts, just kind of reflecting on what the topics were that week, and then the reply backs feel a bit tough. But just really basic general reflections. Often I'll give them a prompt question to answer. But I'd really just like to learn a little bit more about how to deepen some of that, because I think that a lot of the responses I got just didn't really go into a lot of deeper thinking.
Okay, good. Okay, so hopefully you're in the right place, and hopefully we can help you get there. And it's interesting that you said you used the discussion board. So then do students respond to other students' reflections, or do you respond to the students' reflections?
They would respond to each other.
Okay. And let me ask the next question. Do you see then, does that help? Does it continue the dialogue or does it kind of respond and end?
It's response and ends, it's very much them meeting the requirement and moving on. I think a lot of people have had that challenge.
Okay, okay. And so that there's one aspect, and I don't want to overlook anybody who might have want to comment on Zoom. So there is the aspect of, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there's a lot of things about reflection. So Quita and I were talking, we could go on for hours with this, but trust is important. So if you're going to ask somebody to share things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get deeper in how you can get to, the deeper aspects of reflection. There has to be a level of trust. And so whether it's a level of trust between the students and each other, if they're going to share their reflections, or if it's a level of trust between the professor or the teacher and the student. Unless that trust is there, you're not going to get a real perspective on what the student is thinking or what they might be feeling, especially if you had maybe a particularly emotionally charged conversation in the classroom. And that leads me to another thing that you want to think about is if you are going to ask students to reflect, and if you're going to use it on a regular basis, it can be somewhat exhausting if you're always using it, okay? And so when you do use it, you may want to think about, okay, when am I going to use it? So that you're really helping them delve into more of the deeper types of experiences or the more emotionally or whether it's politically charged, emotionally charged, socially charged topic, that you give them time for that so that they don't if they're doing reflections all the time, it's like, oh, I don't, there's really nothing to write about this week. And there might not be anything to write about that week. So just be aware of that too. It is particularly helpful for the practice disciplines, because when students get out into their practice environments, or if they're going to role play or do some kind of a simulation before their practice experiences, it helps them to think about their thinking in particular situations. And so it's really effective for those kinds of situations, but it's equally effective in the classroom. So, and I have resources for you. I have a whole file that I'll share with you. I couldn't get into it on my OneDrive today for whatever reason, but I will figure out how to share that with everyone who's interested. And you can see how they are using it in digital literacy. They're using reflection in architecture. There's, there's multiple uses for it. You can use it in almost any classroom situation or discipline. So that's just some aspects. So there was a question on Zoom? No, we're good. Okay. All right. So I didn't want to jump ahead there. Anybody else?
I teach the theory and practice of Buddhist meditation, and journaling is their assignment. So they need to meditate for 10 to 20 minutes every day, and they need to write a journal about how was the meditation, how was the day, and anything happened in their life. And I found that at the beginning they just wrote a few lines. Getting longer and then toward the end of the semester.
So that's an interesting concept, because there's a lot of literature out there that when you use reflection, students, if it's an ongoing process and it's part of their repertoire, they get to deeper levels of reflection, and that gets to the whole idea of levels of reflection. Is anybody familiar with that? Levels of there's a lot of theories out there about there's different levels of reflection, and that and they're theories, okay, but if using the right questions and using the right kind of guidance, you can get students to that really deep level where they're not only working through what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and what they learned from the situation, but then, like Sequita said, how they then are going to apply their new learning in either their career or their life or in future classes, or whatever the topic is. So that's pretty good. And I'm thinking probably the meditation also helped with that. Had you ever considered flipping it and having them journal first and then meditate?
Oh, I tried. There was a section of before meditation and after meditation.
Oh, so you do a pre and post?
Yes.
Okay. And that also, there's also that whole pre-reflection. So in particular, if it's going to be a topic that's a little bit more challenging, or if it's going to be a practice environment, or if it's going to be I always have my students do it with simulation. Do their pre-reflection, like what are they thinking, what were they feeling as they were preparing for this, and then move them through the process of during the situation, what were you feeling, what were you thinking, and all the way through. And so then go back, okay, you were thinking about this in the beginning, now how have you, what has changed from your pre-reflection to your post-reflection. But again, that meditation and that writing, it's such a deep experience for students. It can really help them really grasp their learning, putting it down on paper, the hand to the mind, can be very effective. So what does it mean to reflect? Kind of throw that out there. Because if you say to your student, I want you to write a reflection on, oh my God, what am I going to do? Go ahead.
Maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe a process of understanding about your activities, what went well and what did not go well, or what you need to improve, what you need to continue with.
Okay, all right, that's part of it. If you look at the literature, it's really difficult to find one definition of reflection. And then when you get into reflective journaling, reflective learning, critical reflectivity, there's different definitions all the way through. These are just a few, and I'm wondering why I'm having difficulty scrolling here. So, oh, here we go. Okay, so here's a few definitions that I wanted to share with you that are out there in the literature. When I did my work, I used a lot of David Bowles' theory, his levels of reflection. He's still writing and still doing research on reflection, and he did his original work back in like 1985. But this is one of his definitions. And then this is a newer one. And then if you look into the literature, there's been more and more literature on defining reflection and levels of reflection. It basically, if you look at the newer theories and the newer literature on it, it's basically the same, a slight version on like Mesereau's and Bowles' work, and they're probably one of the earliest. Dewey was one of the very earliest, around the turn of the previous century, where he really challenged the educational systems on getting students to think about their learning rather than just teaching them and testing them, getting them to think about that metacognitive process of what has occurred to allow me to, understand, and then again, put into action what I have learned. So I just gave you some sources here, and again, I'll make this available to anybody that's interested in the file. But Mesereau then really took it a lot further. According to Mesereau, there's 7 levels of reflection, and that adult learners, when guided and supported appropriately, can really reach that level of critical reflectivity, where they're not only moving and thinking through what their learning has been about, but then again, being able to recognize what they've learned, how they've learned it, and then put it into action. But Sean, you'll see Sean's work just about everywhere. These are some of the seminal works. Reflection in action and reflection on action. And he does a lot of work with reflective with practitioners and teaching practitioners to be reflective practitioners. But his ideas are that experts, because they've learned to reflect, they've learned to think about their thinking, they've learned to recognize, what they know and what they don't know, and when they need to get more information when they don't know something. When they're in a critical situation at the expert level, they have what's known as tacit knowledge, where they'll be able to think through a critical situation and just do it, just take the correct action and just do it. But then have difficulty later explaining that, because it's that learning now is so deeply ingrained in them. They really have to step back to reflect on action and talk about how they were able to move through the steps to come whatever decision they came to, or whatever action they decided to take on that. So again, when you look at Sean, it's usually the reflection in action, the reflection that's taking place while the event or while the classroom is going on. And what are you thinking at that time? And then later going back to the event. And sometimes with a little bit of a time, 24 hours, 48 hours. If you go like a week out, you start to lose. But if you ask students to write their reflections in with about 24 to 48 hours, it's a little bit fresher in their minds. And it will be, if they're able to really respond to your questions and delve into their feelings and their thinking, you'll get probably a little bit deeper of a response. Now, if you think about levels of reflection, you kind of want to get, there is this theory that some students can't reflect. Okay, and I'm probably talking a little bit more than what I wanted to, so please jump in here at any point in time. But there is this theory that some students can't reflect. And it's the idea that if you ask students questions, you'll just get a report back of what happened in class that day. Like, what did I do in school today? So-and-so said this, so-and-so did that, this is what we talked about, and that's it. That's as far as they go with it. That's not what you want. I mean, yes, they reflected, they gave you a description of what happened in class that day, but they didn't really explore their own thinking. And so that's where you get into you might ask for that description without any judgment or anything initially. And then, okay, well then while that was happening, what were you feeling? What were you thinking? Did it challenge your thinking in any way? Did it, can you relate this to anything that you've learned previously? Have you learned a theory about this? Have you had an exposure to an experience like this or a discussion like this at some time in the past? And what's different? Go ahead.
So in my intro to sociology class, the class is structured around the sociological imagination, which is kind of a foundational concept of basically implanting your sociological lens in your brain permanently, which I give them informed consent about at the beginning of the semester.
Can everybody hear Betsy on Zoom?
But
Yes, we can hear. Thanks.
I'm sorry, Kate, I'm having trouble hearing you.
No, I said yes, we can hear
You
her.
can hear
Thank
her?
you.
Okay,
Yes,
okay,
thank
keep
you.
going.
So,
Thank you.
6 or 8 times over the semester, they meet in a small group, and it's the same small group. And it's just in class, small group conversations, where I try to encourage them as a small group to apply the concept we're talking about to their personal observations, social life, in some environment, their family, education, something. And what you were just saying is basically what I have them take turns submitting a report, which is, a very brief 2 minutes, just tell me what you talked about, give me some highlights. But now I'm thinking, oh, I guess I could actually build in like a 5-minute reflection that they could do collectively. Like, what did you learn today? What was surprising? What was, and I do have a question like that on the report form for the individual filled out. So it's, it's supposed to be a reflective activity for them, but I'm thinking I could actually build that into the group discussion so that the reflection exercise can be a collective thing and that they just report on that as well.
So, yeah, you might want to, to make it gradual as they get more comfortable with each other if they're in the same groups, because again, that level of trust, you want them to kind of get used to sharing, what they might be thinking and what they might be feeling as far as that, to build that trust. So there's a good example as to how you can take it further. So, anybody else?
I was just gonna ask, what is your perspective, or what is anybody's perspective on reflecting, just thinking versus reflective thinking and then writing?
Good question. Anybody want to go with that one?
One more time.
What's the perspective on being reflective, just thinking, and then being reflective and writing that reflection out?
I think there are huge difference between these two, because your thinking is really before that. Or writing is more the you need to formulate in logical way so that you can be understand. So I think reflective writing has much more deeper understanding of what they are actually doing.
I think so also. I just wanted to put it out there and see where everybody is. There's a distinct difference, right?
Go
I
ahead.
think writing presumes a reader, whereas your thinking doesn't necessarily. So your thinking is private automatically unless you choose to speak to someone about it. Or, but writing it down, you're like, okay, someone's going to read this most likely. I think we all write for a reader. So I think that's really the difference, is thinking about your reflection happens automatically, sometimes to the point of rumination, right? But when you write, you also have to sort of sort through the rumination to write down what's important, and that can be very hard for students.
I agree. I'm not sure that I agree that reflection's automatic though.
Inside your head.
For some people. And this is my opinion. Okay. I think I do believe that some individuals, some students need to be guided to think a little bit deeper. But that's been my experience. Now, maybe in those situations, those students just didn't want to go any deeper for whatever reason. And that's their choice. Okay. But I think I have to be careful what I say here, but I think that if you look at what's going on around us, I think if people thought a little bit more, I think there's I honestly, I don't agree with that statement that it's automatic, because I don't think it's automatic. I think that's why it's important for me to teach students, because I do believe that there are some students that, when you talk about levels of reflection, in BAD in particular, we'll say this, it's not linear. Okay, there are some students that will go right to, this is what happened, this is what I learned, and this is what I'm going to do with what I learned, and with very little guidance. And then there's some students that, they just can't put it down on paper. They don't, and again, maybe it was an emotionally charged conversation or experience, and they don't want to go any deeper. They don't want to go there. And that gets all into the ethics of reflection. And so that's a whole nother conversation. Hopefully we can touch on it a little bit here.
But I also want to explore or challenge the notion of we write for others to read. Because if you've ever had a diary, you don't write for others to read your writing, to express yourself, to get it out, to tell the environment, if you will, and not a particular person. So you're writing in the context of reflection is really for expressing. It's not for somebody else to read. In fact, a lot of times you don't want anybody else to read. You're writing to express yourself, to cultivate your thinking and to understand your thinking around it. The students don't know that that's happening, but that's essentially what's happening. And that's why I love reflection so much, is because there's something that's going on cognitively as you write that causes some learning to happen, causes some advancement to happen, causes some development to happen, causes you to challenge your thinking even. There's a lot that's going on as you're writing that
Right.
reflection. It's not just, oh, you're writing for somebody to
I
read.
agree.
And I also believe that instead of just having students reflect, we should teach them why we're having.
Why it's important.
Why is this important?
Yeah.
What's happening to you as you're doing this? You're developing a schema, a mental model, thoughts about learning. So there's some things happening cognitively, metacognitively behind the scenes that is important
Exactly.
to support our learning.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, just a follow-up, but what if the professor will be reading the reflection?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, you don't really want, and that's why with these journals, the ones that I talked about earlier, I'm the only one that sees those. I do not share, because I want them to be open, and I talk to them, part of the covering of the syllabus and whatever. I tell them, this journal is for you, it's not for me. I will read it, but it's not for me. It's really for you to understand what you're going to learn, what you're going to put into place, and make a plan for your learning, and not just, say that I learned something. So I really go through reflection in the process of reflection and what it does for you. And I don't think we should just have students reflect and, just tell them to reflect. I think we should tell them. why they-
You have to,
why
you
they
have to give them that background, and you have to give them some, I'm of the opinion that they also need some guidance.
Yeah.
But, I'm gonna get, I sorry, I didn't go up. One of the caveats to reflection as well is that, and again, it gets to that level of trust, is that you may only hear what they think you want to hear.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that's why you want that level of trust, or at least to try to get to that point, so that it doesn't matter. They trust you enough. If they're going to share their journals with you, or their reflections with you, or if you make it a requirement, there has to be that level of trust that they will openly share what they're really thinking and feeling. I mean, they may think that your class is, let's just say, well, that was a waste of time, are you going to be able to take that? And they should feel free enough to do that, and you should be secure enough to hear that. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's interesting. I'll make one point and then Tate has a comment in the chat. I think that's interesting that you say that, because in my mind, like, I would certainly censor my thoughts or to be what I think the professor wanted to hear, I'm a people pleaser, so I would do that, I think. And even in my diary, thinking about my diary, I do the same thing. I write as if my children are going to be reading it and going to enjoy it. So I think I even censor my thoughts there too, that kind of thing. So that's an interesting point. Tate's point, though, he's agreeing to an earlier comment, and he says, I think that knowing that you have to write about it forces you to refine your thoughts. It gets you into communication mode, which demands refinement.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but go ahead.
I'd like to mention something that you're really touching on something that I think you have to also factor in. You said developing that relationship of trust. That's very hard, because what people are talking about is being vulnerable.
Yep.
Vulnerability plays a big key in self-reflection in terms of writing it and sharing information with people.
Exactly.
So therefore, we have a natural inclination to be a little defensive of what we're going to say, what we're not going to say, what we think the professor wants us. So it's multi-layered. So that trust that you're talking about, to me, seems multi-layered. That's why I think we have to develop a good context, we have to develop a good sentence structure. If we leave it too broad, some students are going to be out there and they're going to be lost. But if you hone in, be a little bit more specific in terms of what you want to reflect on, what you're looking for, I think it helps guide them. But that trust that you're talking about, it takes time, people are vulnerable.
Right.
And do I feel like I want to be that vulnerable with my professor? Do I feel like I want to be that vulnerable with my, in the public? That's basically what we're asking people to do.
Yeah.
Expose their vulnerabilities.
And that's
It's not
why
easy.
oftentimes reflections get deeper later in the semester if
Exactly.
they feel supported in that process. And not, and you, again, you accept them where they are. It's their reflection.
Right.
It's their perspective on what they've learned or what has developed from the conversation or the experience, whatever it is. So again, supporting them in that process.
By the way, if you're doing online, you can do the discussion journal and everybody sees it, but you can be, the discussion board, everybody sees it, but you can do the journal and only the faculty, only
Right.
the professor.
Exactly, if you do it that way. Now, another way to assist, I think, students to maybe get to the point where they do. Just think about this. If you're going to use this in your classes, to maybe allow students to keep their journals private, and then at the end of the course, okay, what did you learn from journaling? And so that they can be as vulnerable as they want in their own journal, and then share with you what they learned from that process at the end of the course. And that way they can still protect what they want to protect, and you can still get a perspective of what they learned from that process.
And that's what I was saying, the question, how do you pose that question? Really helps. When I ask you, to really share, if you're saying, what did you learn from the journal experience? I like that.
Yeah.
That's safe.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and so especially again, when you have those hot topics, those charged topics in the classroom that you want them to think a little bit deeper about, but maybe there's feelings that they have that they don't feel comfortable sharing with the professor or on the discussion board. So again, you'll only get so far, and you have to respect that. Any other? I knew this was going to be a great discussion. I knew we could spend hours on this. Let me just check the time. Okay, it's 10:20. All right, so there are theories that there are levels of reflection. You do have to consider that, and I also included some current research. One of the bigger topics that you'll see out there in the literature now about using reflection in your courses is assessing reflection. And so then that gets to the whole idea of, do you grade students' reflections? If I do have an instrument to kind of look at levels of reflection and to give you some ideas for questions, because you can actually have a dialogue with a writing dialogue with students to help get them through additional levels. Okay, so you explained to me what happened in class today. What were you thinking when we were talking about that in class today? And this could be a back and forth, written conversation with the student. Those kinds of interactions take time. Reflection takes time, and it takes time to read reflections. So if you're going to use them in your classes, you need to consider that. If you're going to ask students to reflect and you're going to ask them to share their reflections with you, I know this sounds intuitive and we should know that, but believe me, it happens. You really should read their reflections and give them some kind of feedback. It does happen that students do reflections and they expect feedback and never get feedback. So even if you give them that response back, that you recognize what it is they were thinking, or you recognize what they were feeling, or you give that response, that's important for students if you're going to ask them to share their journals and share their reflections with you. So keep that in mind. But should we grade students' reflections? I'm jumping ahead here, but we'll come back to some of the other topics as well. Should we grade students' reflections, do you think?
It can be, maybe if you want.
I'm sorry?
If you want, it can be.
You can, and I'm only gonna, I mean, that's entirely up to the professor whether or not you grade reflections, but if you're going to grade reflections, there's a higher likelihood that you're gonna get back what the student thinks you want, rather than a true perspective of what they're experiencing or what they've, their perspective on something. So, go ahead.
Let me ask, when you say grading, are you looking at, let's say that the reflection, the journaling is part of a certain percentage of your grade? Are we looking at grading the content that they're saying, or are we looking at grading the time, the expectation?
Thank you for asking that question to allow me to clarify that. That's a good question. I'm talking about actually grading the actual reflection and the content and not giving them a percentage of the course grade for completing their journals. It's usually a check, you did it. You did it. And I may also say, choose a few, like, take a topic that you really want to journal about. You don't have to do every single class. You don't have to do every single simulation. Choose one that you really think you want to explore a little bit further, so that it's not, you don't want to burden them too much with, because again, it takes time for them. If they're really going to get deep into that learning and that reflective, whatever they're doing, which I want to come back to the idea of writing versus not. And that takes time. That takes time. And then it takes time for you to read as well. Go ahead.
I read both ways. For the Buddhist meditation, I just like mark. And then of course I give comment because I read. Usually the mark, if they submit it, then that's a grade. But in my other courses, I give the 10-minute and for the end of the class, they give the reflection sheets, or nowadays Google sheets, so that they can write it. But if their writing is less than 3 sentences, then I grade it. Because otherwise they don't think. Like for example, when I teach the history of the tea, then students usually say that, oh, this is good. Oh, this is bad.
Right.
So I said, English has the most of the vocabulary in the world, and then when you express what is your sensation is good enough. So I ask them to give more, what do you reflect on? What is this taste of the tea triggers you to think about something? So if they don't write it, then I grade it really down.
Okay, so you're still looking for a certain level of thinking, and you're guiding them along that way. And again, I mean, it's obviously your choice whether or not you grade, but just consider that. But that's also helping them to get to a deeper level. So if they want that grade, they're going to have to think a little bit deeper, and that's the flip side of that. So that's good.
I only grade if they did. I asked 6 questions. They have to answer the 6 questions. I don't tell them that write more than 3 sentences or whatever, but they have to answer.
Yeah.
Comprehensively the 6 questions.
Yeah.
So.
And then it's like, are you going to look for grammar and spelling and all that too? Again, it's a reflection. So is it really, so go ahead again.
I think you also have the fact that these freshmen, sophomore, is the master. You have to also the fact that because I teach a lot of freshmen in and I had to do the writing of science, academics, and freshmen they going to do research. And then in conclusion, this is what we have to see my tennis class, but it's my conclusion, I allow I can know a little more latitude, but it's more open-ended. I'm going to be a little bit more specific and say, okay, you got all this information, now reflect on how does this impact your thinking and your way of doing. So that's how I'm going to use this self-reflection, injecting themselves in the information. Okay, you got this information, how does it impact you in terms of leadership and management? So that's one of the.
So that's what you, that's again, taking, if you're working with Bowd or Mesro, that's taking that learning and then putting it into action. So thinking through all of that and then, okay, now what will this do for you in your future, in your career, for society, for whatever? Again, that's the whole idea, is that they're going to take that information and then do something constructive, hopefully, with it, you know, with what they've learned. So that's excellent. Now, does it have to be writing? I use writing to help me work through problems. When I'm really stuck on something, I'll just start writing. And then sometimes, by the, you know, all of a sudden it'll come to me, or I use that and then all of a sudden it'll come to me later. And I honestly, I really think that you know, that free writing has helped me many times work out, you know, problems that I just couldn't quite figure out. Oh, that's how I can do that. You know, after I took the time to just, you know, do some free writing. So there is, and I'm sure I don't, is anybody psych here in the room? I know there's a lot of psychological research on the writing and touching and the hand and the mind and the metacognition that all goes, you know, that whole process. But what if you have this, like, I'll give you a case. I had a student who had dyslexia and just, you know, it was very difficult. She said, you know, if you're going to ask me, I have to sit there with a ruler. This is going to, I have kids. I don't have to, can I just talk to you? Can we just have a conversation? And well, why not? I mean, if I can ask you the questions and you feel comfortable with me to share where you're going, you know, you're thinking through this, then why not? If it's going to be so difficult for you to be able to put all this in writing, with, you know, to the degree that I'm going to be able to read it because words aren't going to be, letters aren't going to be transposed, that, you know, those kinds of things. And I will tell you, when I do my simulations, I ask the students to reflect, but when we're in the debriefing, I use all of the questions that I use in reflection, so that we are reflecting out loud and we're reflecting as a group. Okay, tell me what you were doing, what you were thinking about, and what were you feeling before you got here. Tell me, all right, and then tell me what happened, and it's just describe what happened. Don't judge, because that's the first thing they want to do. They want to jump in and judge what they did wrong. I don't want to, I'm not interested in your judgment now. We can talk about that later. What I want to know is just describe to me what happened. What was the scenario? Okay, then what were you thinking when this was going on? What were you feeling when this was going on? So what actually was the problem? Were you able to identify this? You know, and I might ask specific questions about that. So then, so we go all the way through to, so what did you learn? What did you learn about yourself in this situation? And that question oftentimes helps them get to a level of self-awareness that they may not have had before. And oftentimes it's, and it comes out in writing too. Oftentimes it's, I was really, I had butterflies. I was really, really scared. But then when I stepped back and I took a breath and or when so-and-so said this, then it triggered. And then I was able to, and so it helps them there is a perspective on, reflection that helps students to develop self-awareness. And if you're going to be out there as a teacher, as a business person, as a, you know, whatever your profession is going to be, you want to have a degree of self-awareness, so you recognize when you're stressed, when you're not listening to someone, when you should be listening to someone, all of those kinds of things. So those kinds of questions can help students think that through as well. And then I take it further. Okay, so then what did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about, because I'm nursing, what did you learn about nursing? And now what will you do with this information now that you've learned it? If you have a similar situation like this in the future, what will you do differently? So, you know, to help them take that all the way through to the that entire process. And the gentleman in the back, and I'm sorry, I should have asked everybody to introduce themselves in the beginning, but I was so nervous, I overlooked that, I'm so sorry. Your name, sir? Okay, Emmanuel, you mentioned the word context. And context is very, very important in reflection. It encompasses many things, so keep that in mind. Even your students' own cultural background might determine how much they're going to be willing to share with you in a reflection. They may want to, but they may have certain, beliefs about certain things that their cultural beliefs may deter them to be able to share what they really want to share. So think about the situation itself. And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. If you're going to ask them to reflect, make sure it's, and they're going to give you, their time and their feelings and their thoughts on something, make it worthwhile. Make sure it's an experience or a discussion that will really help them, move through and learn from that particular experience. Since they are going to be devoting their time to it. What else did I want to? And Sequita, you talked about the purpose. So why are we, why are you asking them to reflect? Hopefully it's not just I hate the word busy work, but it's not just an assignment, because you need to, fill a grade, make sure that it's purposeful so that it's meaningful for them and meaningful for you. Again, it does take time, so keep that in mind for both you and for the student. What are some, let's say you do have students journal, and there are things, and they're being open and honest, but there's things that are being said that could cause harm to others or harm to the student. How do you handle that?
Well, I know we have, I don't know if this is what we meant, but we have like is it clarity reporting, like where you have to report like any, that's criminal activity, I think, but there's like confidentiality, you have limited confidentiality. So I think you have to make that clear in the syllabus.
Yeah.
Like if you talk about, I don't know, that you were recently assaulted, I probably have to say something to someone.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know, something like that.
Okay. Because there have been situations where students have expressed suicidal tendencies in their journal writings, and you have to act on them. And so that's some of the ethical issues surrounding journaling. And so when you go into this, you need to be aware of the things that may arouse. Now, it may entirely depend on the situation, the context, okay, the topics, those kinds of things. But just be aware that things like that could happen. And so you need to be upfront with students that, if you share something in your journals that, or in your reflective writing that it has the potential to cause harm to anyone, I may need to take this further. Okay, we may need to have a discussion, or I may just need to take this further. So that needs to be shared up front as well. But if a student's putting that in their journal, they're probably crying for help anyhow. Go ahead.
Yeah, I teach organizational behavior and intro management, like Emmanuel. And whenever I see a student or hear about them struggling with depression, or, usually it doesn't get to the suicide thing, but I submit a CARES report, like, and the students know that, that program's there for them, but I don't think they realize how helpful it can be until somebody else submits for them. Because I've had students thank me for submitting the most, because they didn't really know that it can be that helpful.
Yeah.
But they'll put them in contact with all the wonderful people that we have in the counseling center. It's just a great program.
Yeah, so we have CARES, and so everybody's aware of CARES, right? And how to put in a CARES referral. Okay. Yeah, so that's an important thing to share. Thank you. All right, so let's see. We talked about ethics, we talked about context, talked about time and experiences. All right, and so we looked at that. I have a list of references as well, if you want to take a look at this one I didn't actually, the one that's highlighted, I didn't actually get a chance to access. I do want to add one more before I share this with anyone. But I do want to stop sharing for a second and bring up a couple of documents that you may or may not find helpful. But I'd like to share them with you in case you want to consider them. This is, let me hold on a second. I will make sure I'm sharing with the people on Zoom. Let me shrink this down. Let me shrink this, pull that back up again. Okay, all right, so this is, these are some of the journal reflections. We did we had students look at a video on racism in healthcare, the history of racism in healthcare, and then we had them participate in a panel discussion, an interprofessional panel discussion. It was a multi-ethnic, multiracial panel discussion and interprofessional as well, on racism in healthcare. And so we had students then journal or respond to these guided reflective questions about the experience after they saw the video and then after they participated in the panel discussion. So we had them explore what they were thinking about racism before, what were they feeling about racism in healthcare before, and then in what ways did their thoughts and feelings change about racism in healthcare after the video and the panel discussion. What did you learn about racism in healthcare that you didn't know before? What was the most valuable lesson you learned? What did you learn about yourself? What will you do with what you learned? And how will you apply this new learning in your daily life and in your future profession? So if you give students a guide, if you really want to help them think through their thinking, if you give students a guide and you phrase your questions in a way that will help them actually think through the process, you can help them to get to the point where they will actually be able to hopefully identify how this will apply to their future. By the way, I'm going to share some of this, their reflections with the School Health Sciences tomorrow in our meeting. But the feedback that we got from students was so, I can't even, I wish we could publish every single one of those journal entries, because the level that they, and these were students across the spectrum. They were undergraduate, okay, and graduate. And so again, don't underestimate your undergraduate students, because they can be, and many were, just as deeply reflective. They may not have specifically tied it into a discipline if they weren't that far along as far as like what careers they were pursuing, but many did. So again, if you give them something worthwhile to reflect on and you give them some guidance, you can help them move through the process. So this is just one example. I have another one that's a little bit more in depth, and I adapted this one for it's from an article that was published a couple of years ago. Oh, thank you. Hold on 1 second. And it's this one. This is Nielsen's Guide for Reflection. And this really gets into a lot of questions. So again, the other one's a little bit shorter. It's not as, this is the pre-reflection and then the reflection in action, if you're subscribing to Sean's theory about the reflection in action, the reflection on action. And then so after after you've thought about the reflection in action, then going back to the experience and thinking about the experience later. So here's some additional questions to help students once again to move through the process. And this one actually gets through the different phases of interpreting and responding. And this Nielsen's guide is based on a different theoretical model of clinical judgment. So this one is a little bit more specific to healthcare, but most of these questions can be adapted. Most of these questions can be adapted to almost any situation. Yes, I'm gonna, if anybody wants it, let me put my email up here. Send me an email and I will send you a link to the file with these documents, okay? I'm just gonna put Gmail. And then the other document that I want to share with you is a doc. This is called the Guide to Reflection, and this is the one that's from Nielsen and Stragnell and Jester. Okay. And it's published, it's out there in the literature as well, and it's on my reference list for this handout, so you'll also see it there as well. But I also wanted to share, we have 1 minute left here. So I want to just real quickly share, this is what I developed for my dissertation. And this particular,
You'll need to be sure.
oops. Thank you. See, that's why you're here.
You know, at the top left, share screen, and it would show whatever you're looking at. Like, is that gonna new share?
New share, I'm not seeing it where at.
Like, at the bottom, there.
This
And then
right?
choose the first screen, where it says screen,
Yeah.
and it'll show whatever you're showing.
Okay, thank you. All right, that's how I get confused. This is the level of reflection on action assessment. And again, it's based on Bowd's theory. But it starts with the description and then associating it to any beliefs about or feelings about the incident. And then, so if the student's having difficulty, here's some additional questions that you can, if you're going to do that dialogue, here's some additional questions that you can ask to move them a little bit further along. How are they gonna, how does this relate to previous situations or learning? And then again, additional questions that you can use to guide them a little bit further in that particular category. Validation, did they seek feedback on this, or did they come up with something that allowed them to say, well, this is what this is? And then, again, additional questions to guide them further if they're struggling at that level. And then this is identifying what they did according to this and what happened maybe as a result of what they did or what the final outcome was. And then the sixth level according to Bowd, like now that you've learned this, now what will you do with this? How will you apply this to your future? And it's not used as a grade. It's just used to guide students to deeper reflection. If you have students who are either struggling or you really want to help them see how they can learn from a particular experience and guide them a little bit further. So again, I'm willing to share that as well. And that's in the file. So I will share the whole OneDrive file with you that has articles in there as well and other resources. So it is 10:47 and we were supposed to end at 10:45. So thank you for your time and attention. Any final comments or questions?
This has been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Did you have a comment?
Did we talk about some benefits of reflections? I think some research might have found about that, but I wanted to learn more.
You know what? Thank you for that. So the benefits of reflection are that it hopefully will help students learn to think deeply, to critically think. There's a lot of literature out there that says that guided reflection and reflection itself will help students get to develop their critical thinking skills. There's tons of research out there that, and for many different disciplines, that talks about how reflection helps them to develop their professional identity. If you can help them guide through, like to identify what they've learned, it's that sense of satisfaction and also self-awareness, because part of the reflection might be that they didn't think they knew anything, and then when they were in the situation, they realized how much they really knew, and so that gave them confidence. So there's so many benefits to reflection. What you will see in the literature is that there's no real actual, most of this is what faculty say and it's what students say. There really isn't there's no clear-cut literature out there that says that reflection actually changes practice, okay? I just have to put that out there.
I think the reflection, the benefit of reflection is mutual, because in my case, I think I learned from my students that what I missed.
Thank you. Yes, yes. Did you get that feedback on what they were able to learn? And the other thing, and I forgot to mention this, it helps you correct any misperceptions that they have too, especially in nursing. If they totally miss something, you know, guiding them gently to, had you thought about this? You know, that type of thank you.
Thank you, sorry.
Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you. This was fun. Thank